वेलकम मैम। जय भीम, जय बिरसा, जय फुले, जय सावित्री, जय फतिमा, जय मंडल, क्रांतिकारी सलाम, सतरंगी सलाम, फुल जुआर, जय संविधान। Here Bapsa CUG organizing a series of lecture. In this series, today we have distinguished scholar. I am briefing about her. Madam Geetha is an Indian feminist activist, writer, and historian. She writes on caste, gender, education, and civil rights. She has carried out research on the nature and proliferation of NGOs operating in Tamil Nadu. She has set up the Federation of Women's Groups in Tamil Nadu and also the editorial director at Tara Books. After completing her studies, she was active in the women's movement for over 2 decades, even as she worked at giving extramural lectures to women workers, activists, and students. She was also an active member of Snehidi, a women's group that worked with those who faced abuse in the family. Raja Durai and Geetha ma'am have published in Tamil and English on the Tamil non-Brahmin movement, including the radical self-respect movement of E.V. Ramasamy Periyar, and is now engaged in writing, teaching, and research on subjects related to women. Some of her notable publications are translation of 2 novels of Perumal Murugan in Tamil into English, Towards a Non-Brahmin Millennium from Leothis Thas Periyar, Undoing Impunity, Speech After Sexual Violence, History of the Children's Picture Book from Soviet Lithuania to India. Here today's topic is Ambedkar and Modern Buddhism. I would request Geetha ma'am, please enlighten us.
Thank you very much, Pradhani. Jai Bhim to all of you. I'm very glad to be speaking to Bapsa, students and friends and comrades. When I was asked to speak on your platform, you very kindly said you choose your own topic. And I thought it would be interesting to speak about something that I think is a very important aspect of Ambedkar's life, his conversion to Buddhism. And I think more than any other time, currently, it is an important subject for us to study and reflect on. So, which is why I thought I would share some ideas on this subject with you. I want to start by saying that Ambedkar, unlike a lot of people that we associate with modern progressive causes, he took religion very seriously. And he engaged with religion all his life in different ways. In his early days in public life, when he came back from the United States after his education, he wondered if Hinduism could be reformed. While he wasn't sure that that was possible, he continued to engage with Hindu reform groups, including the Arya Samaj. And he kept pointing out that all of you speak about the greatness of Hindu philosophy. You keep saying that the ultimate philosophical principle of Atman, Paramatman, in which all of us are the same. That's all very well because it's all an idea, but in practice you are not like that. You have a very grand idea of human unity, that all human beings are equal and all of them are part of this superhuman Atman called Brahma. But in real life, you're not like that. You practice caste differences. You're very violent and cruel with respect to the so-called untouchables. So you have a big gap between your theory and practice. So while he wanted to give a chance to Hindu reformers to rethink their religion, he wasn't personally convinced that they would do it. And he stayed in this position for nearly 8 or 9 years. But at the same time, he kept telling the Hindus that why must not the so-called untouchables convert to another religion? As early as 1927, he raised the question of conversion. And he said, if you do not consider us as fellow Hindus, if you do not treat us with the equality and respect we deserve, we have every right to leave this religion. And I think he made that choice very clear in the mid 1930s when he announced in 1935 that though he was born a Hindu, he will not die as a Hindu. And so everybody got very excited and worried. Was Ambedkar going to convert to Islam? Was he going to embrace Christianity, or would he take to Sikhism? And a lot of people raised questions about this announcement that he had made. Ambedkar also followed up on his announcement with this very important conference that he addressed in Bombay in 1936, where he spoke on the all important topic of what path to salvation, where he made an argument as to why he thinks Dalits must convert. And he said, people ask me, what will you get out of conversion? Shouldn't Dalits be interested in more tangible things? Shouldn't they have better economic lives? Shouldn't they have more political rights? Why are you insisting that they should convert? To which he made this very interesting answer. He said, Dalits need all of this, but you cannot sort of put them down on a sheet of paper and say, first economic rights, then political rights, then conversion. It's not going to work out like that because they're all very interconnected. And for myself, I think it's very important to get out of Hinduism. And then in the talk, he goes on to explain why he wants to abandon Hinduism, exit from Hinduism. And he starts by discussing the three principles that he considered very important: liberty, equality, and fraternity. And he raised the question, does Hinduism value these three principles? And he went on to show how Hinduism actually is completely opposed to these three principles. And for anyone who wants to lead a dignified, self respecting life and treat fellow human beings with equality and respect, he or she cannot really stay within Hinduism. And he told his audience, largely Dalit audience, that he had made up his mind he was going to convert, but he will not force anybody to do it. They must be convinced of the need to convert. And he quotes from the very important Mahaparinibbana Sutta, which is one of the most famous Buddhist texts, where the Buddha tells Ananda that when Ananda's very upset that the Buddha is on his deathbed, and he says, after your time, who will guide us? And the Buddha says that you don't need any individual to guide you. You be a lamp unto yourself. You, as a human person, you're capable of rational thought. You're capable of making decisions about what is right and wrong. You can be a light unto yourself. So Ambedkar ends that speech by requesting his fellow Dalits that should they wish to convert, they should do so after they have examined the question on their own, after they have thought about it, and then take that decision. So for Ambedkar, conversion wasn't simply a political statement. It wasn't as if he was going to tell the Hindus, you are treating us badly, therefore I am exiting Hinduism. It wasn't as simple as that. He had tried to sort of work with Hindu reformism for nearly a decade. He had realized that he wasn't getting anywhere. And this had become very clear to him after the signing of the Pune Pact. As you all know, the Pune Pact was something that he was forced to accept after Mahatma Gandhi went on a fast. And instead of separate electorates, he had to settle for reserved seats. And instead of Dalits as a constituency electing their own representatives, he had to agree to a two-level voting process. And later on in life, he would say that that was such a blow at Dalit political rights. But at that time, he went with it because the Mahatma's life was at stake. But at the same time, Gandhi spoke of how he was going to take a full-fledged campaign against untouchability amongst the Hindus. And Ambedkar was willing to give that a chance as well. And when Gandhi set up what was first called the Anti-Untouchability League, Ambedkar wrote a very long letter to the secretary of that league, A.V. Thakkar, and he said, if you're going to have an organization to fight against untouchability, then untouchables must be represented in that organization. They must be the ones who coordinate that work. And instead of just doing things that will make Dalit lives better, like building a school or digging a well or finding safe housing, all of these things are important. But more important is to support Dalit struggles for civil rights. When Dalits face a problem locally, to stand by them. These are the things I would want the League Against Untouchability to do. But Gandhi argued that the League will only be an institution of caste Hindus, because he said caste Hindus practice untouchability. This is a chance for them to feel bad about what they are doing, so they must undertake this work. So Ambedkar sort of was not sure how that would actually turn out in practice. But after some time, he realized that whatever Gandhi did, caste Hindus were not going to change themselves overnight. That there was something very deep that made them practice untouchability. And he didn't think that much would come of the Mahatma's work in this domain. So by the mid 30s, he had given up on Hinduism. He didn't think that anything more could be done with it. And he also was extremely unhappy with the way the Pune Pact was turning out. So he decided that what was required was to think of Dalit futures in a completely holistic way. So even as Dalits are seeking political rights, even as they are fighting for their economic rights, because at this time he also starts the Independent Labour Party, 1936. Um, it is important for Dalits to have a sense of self worth and identity, which is very deep and very profound, and which is not simply about claiming a particular identity. He wanted Dalits to feel that they are the universal subjects of history. Now, what did he mean by that? That they can actually identify with a tradition, with a religion, which would make them think of justice, equality, fraternity, and liberty, not just for themselves, but for everybody else. So, which is why he felt that Buddhism would be such a religion. And this is the context in which he came to convert to Buddhism. Though he announced he would convert in 1936, we all know that it took him another 20 years and he converted only in 1956. Now, those 20 years are very important and very interesting because during this time, Ambedkar worked on different fronts. He worked to secure Dalit political rights. He wasn't very successful. Then he found himself in the Constituent Assembly, where he was made the head of the drafting committee of the Constitution, and he worked very, very hard to make sure that the Constitution adopted these three principles: liberty, equality, and fraternity. Um, he also tried to pilot the Hindu Code Bill, as you know, which he saw as a very important measure because he felt Hindu law um, depended on a number of conflicting interpretations. And these interpretations were based on very many religious texts and law books, like from the Manusmriti onwards to the Yagnavalkya Smriti to the Narada Smriti. There were hundreds of Hindu law books. And though you came to court with your problem, the courts would interpret the problem by reading these Hindu law books. So he felt that the time had come for Hindus to give themselves a secular law, not based on religious laws. Because at that time in the Constituent Assembly, the constitution had been accepted, and he felt that one must draw from those constitutional principles and create a civil code which would grant equal rights to women, and very importantly, would make it possible for Hindus to follow laws that are human laws, not laws made by gods or Brahmins. So he had a great deal of investment in the Hindu Code Bill, and as we know, that was not passed. So all this work in the political sphere, while it created some very important things for us as a nation, did not really help Ambedkar move forward with what he wanted for society as a whole, which is to create a social order based on liberty, equality, and fraternity. Now, that was a very revolutionary thing. How does one do that? So, politically, there was only so much he could do. Socially, also, he had tried many things, temple entry, assertion of civil rights. He had also written a great deal about how the caste system worked. And as we know, his very famous definition of the caste system, um, that the caste system is basically a system which is based on what he called graded inequality. It's a very important formulation, because in the caste system, it's like a triangle. It's like this. So as you go up the triangle, Ambedkar explained, you gain respect. So if you are from a caste that is placed close to the apex of the triangle, you get a lot of respect. But you're from a caste that is at the very bottom, you lose respect. So he said it's a system of graded inequality based on an ascending scale of reverence and a descending scale of humiliation. So, in this, he had tried to also interest not just the Dalits, but the so called other castes, those that we call BCs or OBCs or MBCs today, or the so called Shudra communities in fighting the caste system. So he had written a great deal on this subject. He wrote this important book called Who Were the Shudras. So he tried to build, using arguments, using scholarship, a broad based opposition to caste. But he wasn't very sure what sort of cooperation he would get from the so called Shudras. He was always critical of the role they had played in at least in the Bombay province. And right after Mahad, he made this very interesting statement where he said, in the caste system, people who are at the very top, the so-called Dvijas, the twice-born castes, they can afford to be generous because they are very powerful. Whereas those at the very bottom, like the Dalits, want to fight. But those who are in the middle are not quite sure of their identity, and they tend to imitate those who are above them and to treat with disrespect those who are below them. But the sad fact is they themselves do not enjoy full rights. So he had said this about the BC, OBC groups even then, long ago. So he had tried to sort of build a broad sort of unity, and he wasn't always successful. So the social realms also, he wasn't quite sure what could be achieved. In the economic realm, he had tried quite a bit by building the Labour Party, trying to fight for worker rights. And then when he was made a member of the Viceroy's cabinet during the Second World War, he was made the Minister for Labour. And at that time, he was instrumental in passing some very important labor related legislation. But also, he wanted to do much more, but the colonial government wouldn't allow him to do that. For example, he wanted to put in place what we today call a basic minimum wage, not only for industrial workers, but also for agrarian workers. It was quite a revolutionary proposition. But the colonial government said that they are unwilling to do that. So he had tried to sort of push the case for liberty, equality, and fraternity. He had tried to advance the cause of Dalit emancipation from the caste system and to fight to annihilate caste. But each of these areas, whether in the economic domain, the social domain, or the political domain, he realized that there was only so much that was possible, only so much that could be done. But at the same time, even as he was doing all of this between 1936 and 1956, he was thinking of what stops people from fighting caste. Why are people so unwilling to take up against the caste system? And that was when he started thinking that there is something about the religion that people follow that makes it difficult for them to fight caste. So he felt that it's not that Hindus are bad people, certainly not. It is not that they are amoral people, that they don't have morality. That's not true either, because they are conscious of what is right and what is wrong. They are upset if somebody is in trouble and they do wish to help that person. But, and this is what he had to say, but the real problem comes up when the identity of the person is concerned. If it is a Dalit, then they are going to hesitate supporting that person, helping that person. If it is a person from another caste, not the caste to which they belong, they are still going to be reluctant. But if it is somebody from within their own caste community, then they can be very ethical. So basically, Ambedkar felt that whatever conscience that the Hindus had, it's not that they had no conscience. Whatever ethics that the Hindus had, it's not that they didn't have ethics. All of this was limited to their own caste. And he felt the reason for this was the Hindu religion. And he wrote very, very interestingly on this subject. This is what you have in the Collected Works, Volume 3 and Volume 5. Essays such as The Philosophy of Hinduism, essays on the Hindu social order. They're also there in the essays on untouchability that he wrote, volumes 9 and 10. So basically, he tried to understand what stops a Hindu from being an ethical person as such. Why is a Hindu only ethical in a very limited way? And then he went on to argue that it is a Hindu religion. And he has something very interesting to say here, where he says that religions all over the world believe in certain principles, certain ideals. But in no religion is there a principle that accepts and legitimizes inequality. Christians may be unequal amongst themselves. There are poor Christians, there are rich Christians, there are black Christians, there are white Christians. But Christ himself does not differentiate between high and low, rich or poor. Neither do the biblical texts differentiate. Likewise with Islam. But he felt that in Hinduism, whether it is the law books, Manusmriti, or the various Smritis, or texts like the Bhagavad Gita or the Vishnu Purana, these texts accept inequality on principle. And he argues why this is so. He quotes from the Vedas, he quotes from the Bhagavad Gita, and he says, Hinduism is perhaps the only religion which has sanctified, the word he uses is sanctified. It's a very important word. It means that it makes something sacred. And when you make something sacred, you stop questioning it. So Hinduism has rendered inequality sacred. It has said God created us unequal. It created the Brahmins from the Purusha's head, the Shudras from the feet, and the Dalits are even placed outside the Purusha's body. So basically, God himself has made this world unequal. So how can we human beings change it? So which is why he felt that the Hindus are ethical, but they're ethical only within the limits of their own caste group. So the next step for him then was, what does one then do with this religion? Is this religion capable of reform? Because in principle, it doesn't believe in equality. So if you read the Annihilation of Caste, which is the talk he never delivered, you will see that he tells the Arya Samaj, you are interested in reforming Hinduism. But I think Hinduism is opposed to these basic principles of equality, liberty, and fraternity. But if you want to reform your religion, you have to do it in such a way that it honors these three principles. He knew very well that was not possible, but he was such a democratic man. He felt that if somebody thinks it's capable of being reformed, that is something he would like to support. But on this condition that reform must work against the principle of inequality and support the principles of liberty, fraternity, and equality. So he was very convinced from the mid 30s onwards that the Hindu religion fundamentally was opposed to equality. So, what could Dalits or indeed the Shudras or women hoped to gain from this religion? And he spent a lot of time explaining this through his studies of the Bhagavad Gita, through his studies of the Manusmriti, and also sort of trying to understand what had happened in the past. Did people not fight against inequality? And then that's what took him to look at Buddhism in history. And he agreed with those scholars who argued that Buddhism, in fact, had been a revolutionary idea in the ancient past, that it had challenged inequality, it had challenged the authority of the Brahmins, it had taken against the Varna system. So Ambedkar then sort of felt that Buddhism was something that perhaps would provide not just Dalits, but all those who wanted to fight inequality and injustice. It would give them an ethical framework. Because Buddhism had done this in the past, it can do that in the future as well. Now, what's interesting is two things I wish to sort of point out here. One is that why did Ambedkar look to a religion to do that? Why did he look to a philosophical tradition to do that? For example, in Tamil Nadu, where you have the non-Brahmin and anti-caste movement of Periyar, Periyar was a non-believer. He was an atheist. He felt that a human community, a self-respecting community based on comradeship could challenge caste. He didn't think religion was necessary. The communists and the socialists didn't think that religion was necessary to build the unity of workers. So, but why did Ambedkar feel religion was necessary? And I think there are two things we must keep in mind. One is he felt that religion influenced people in a very fundamental way. We may not actually go to a temple or a mosque or a church properly. We may not even read these sacred books. But then religion lives on in everyday practice, the food you eat, the festivals you celebrate, sometimes even the clothes you wear. So religion is sort of part of your customs, it's part of your habits. So it gets into your very, let's say, your everyday life. So therefore, even if I'm not a practicing Hindu, I don't mind exchanging sweets on Diwali with my neighbor. So by exchanging sweets with my neighbor, I become part of that Hindu community, though I may not practice Hinduism. I may even be an atheist. So the point, this is not Ambedkar's example, it's my own, but basically what Ambedkar was trying to communicate was religion helps to bind people together because they see that identity as a very important one, even if they do not actively subscribe to it. But he felt religion should not be a kind of mindless binding of people, because if it does that, it will lead to what has happened in India, which is that people are all bound together, but they're bound together in inequality. They're not bound together in a respectful, equal manner. But religion has the potential also to give us a ethical worldview. It has the potential to bind us together in a fraternal sort of way. And Ambedkar understood religion as playing a role to bring us together in an equal fraternal relationship. So he uses the word religion in many different ways, therefore. So at one level, it is the religion that is there around us. Temple worship, going to the church, doing namaz, the way we all understand religion. At another level, it is a historical development. Human beings created religion very, very long ago in history. And he has a fascinating discussion on how religion changed in relationship to human progress. I'm not getting into that. Maybe at the discussion we can take it up. But basically, for him, religion, in the best sense of the word, had to be ethical. It had to teach us how do we relate to each other as human beings, how do we live together as a society, so that we respect each other, we value each other equally, and we are bound by respect, affection, and justice. So this is how he understood the ideal religion to be, and he felt that the Buddhism, the Buddha's creed and philosophy was ideal, therefore. And he would argue in the book that he wrote, Buddha and his Dhamma, that all world religions, whether it's Christianity or Hinduism or any other religion, what is its morality? So if you take, say, Judaism, the Jewish religion, you have the 10 commandments of Moses. So God gives those commandments to Moses. God tells you what is right and wrong. And you have to believe in that God if you have to practice those 10 commandments. Likewise with Christ, whatever Christ wishes people to do is laid out in the New Testament. And the principles of Christianity are taken from the life and teachings of Christ. And Hinduism is what is there in the Hindu law books, what is there in practice. But Ambedkar said Buddhism is very different because it is not based simply on what the Buddha said. And as he spoke in that meeting where he spoke of what path to salvation, Buddha did not say, follow me. He said, you follow your own thinking and your own conscience. You have the ability to separate right and wrong. You have the ability to think. You choose. You actively choose the right thing. So for Ambedkar, ethics was the basis of Buddhism. It was not the Buddha's teaching so much, but ethics as expounded by the Buddha, which each of us has to accept, value, and follow on the basis of what we think is right and wrong. So there is no such thing as the Buddha laid down these laws and we follow them, but Buddhism gives you that space and that opportunity to be an ethical person. And it tells you that to be ethical is to be religious. So this is why he thinks Buddhism is very important. Now, what's fascinating about Ambedkar's choice of Buddhism is that for nearly 75 years before he converted, or even 100 years, people had discussed Buddhism in India for very many reasons. One is that all the archaeological findings, the Sanchi Stupa, the Ajanta caves, the Elephanta caves, the findings at Nagarjuna, the monuments in Odisha. So suddenly everybody realized that there had been something like Buddhism. And at the same time, a lot of Buddhist manuscripts were published, source material from Sanskrit and Pali. They were all published and made available to a wide audience. And Buddhism fascinated many people because it sounded very rational, it sounded very modern, especially what was in those texts that were published. So a lot of people started researching, reading, and thinking about Buddhism, including Brahmin intellectuals. And a lot of Europeans were very interested in Buddhism. Now, for all these people, Buddhism seemed a kind of um, answer to the worst forms of Brahminical Hinduism. And they wrote about this also. They said Brahminical thought had become very corrupt after the Vedic age, and the Buddha challenged the Brahmin as a priest, challenged the Brahmin's teachings, challenged the superiority the Brahmin granted his own community. And the Buddha did not believe in birth based differences. Therefore, Buddhism is something we can adopt in our modern, rational, democratic life. This was something a lot of people thought about. Um, Scholars wrote about it, historians wrote about it. But most interestingly, the anti caste movements in India, which had started by the mid 19th century, they also actively took up Buddhism. Phule respected and valued the Buddha as a very important predecessor who fought for Shudra, Ati Shudra, Stri liberation. There was also Pandit Ayotitas in Madras, in the Madras province, who converted to Buddhism in the late 19th century and who argued that the original Buddhists of this country are the ones that later on became the so-called untouchables, because Brahminical Hinduism didn't want to admit that Buddhism was a rich and living philosophy, it was a just philosophy, and it tried to get rid of Buddhism in many ways. And one of the ways was to degrade the former Buddhists and call them untouchables. And Ayotidas wrote a great deal on Buddhism in Tamil. He wrote a magnificent life of the Buddha called Adi Vedam. He also said Buddhism had been the original religion of everybody in India. Only later on you had what we call today Hinduism. Anyway, so along with Ayotitas, many Dalits and a few non-Dalits converted to Buddhism in the late 19th century and through the early 20th century. And there was a very active Tamil Buddhist community, not just in Madras, but in different parts of the world, because Tamil laborers, basically Dalits, and some of the more oppressed OBC communities who had gone as laborers to different parts of the British Empire, to Sri Lanka, to Malaysia, Burma, Fiji, Mauritius, different parts, South Africa, Southeast Asia, even into places like Vietnam, Indonesia. So Tamil laborers, some of them converted to Buddhism along with Ayotidas. So there was a sort of neo-Buddhist community in Madras from the late 19th century onwards. And very explicitly, Ayotitas challenged the caste system. He challenged the superiority of the Brahmins. He also said Brahminical knowledge irrelevant and useless. The real knowledge is the one produced by whom we would today call the Bahujans and the Dalits. They are the ones who work, they are the ones who create wealth, they are the ones who really should be in positions of authority, teaching others how to lead a good life. So he did some very fascinating things, and he used Buddhism as a context to talk about some of these things. And then in northern India, in Lucknow, you had Swami Bodhanand. In the United Provinces, what is today Uttar Pradesh, and parts of Punjab, you had two very important anti-caste movements, the Adi Hindu movement in the United Provinces and the Adharm movement in the Punjab. And the Adi Hindu movement was a very broad-based movement. Like Phule, members of the Adi Hindu movement argued that Bahujan Dalits were the original inhabitants of the subcontinent, that the Brahmins came from outside and subjugated them, and so on. Now, Swami Bodhananda was a Brahmin who had converted to Buddhism, and he worked closely with the Adi Hindu movement, and he also set up a vihara and he practiced Buddhism. And he argued that Buddhism was the original religion of a lot of people in India, just like Ayodhidas had done. And this was in the 1920s and afterwards. He converted in 1916. And Ambedkar knew Bodhanand very well, and he visited him many times. And in fact, Kanpur was a center of an early Buddhist movement. Then there were people who had converted individually, like the writer Dharmananda Kosambi, who was a Chitpavan Brahmin from Maharashtra, who converted to Buddhism and who went on to write a great deal on the life of the Buddha, books which Ambedkar used while writing his own Buddha and his Dhamma. He respected Dharmananda Kosambi a great deal. Kosambi tried to bring together socialism and Buddhism in very interesting ways. So there were all these people who were thinking about Buddhism. But I think what was interesting was, if you look at Ambedkar's understanding of Buddhism, he was aware of all these things, but I think what was very different about his own adoption of Buddhism was he made it very clear that it would make for a completely new and different ethical life. And for him, ethics was very important. So ethics was not simply about what to do and what not to do. It's not about on Monday I don't eat, on Wednesday I go to the temple. It's not that. Ethics is about how do I relate to my fellow human beings? How do I cultivate kindness? How do I cultivate equality? So he interpreted the whole Ashtanga Marga in Buddhism, the eightfold path, right speech, right action, right endeavor, all that we associate with Buddhism, explicitly in terms of how we treat each other as human beings. And he also combined his understanding of socialism along with his understanding of Buddhism. So, for example, when he talks about dukkha or suffering, he makes it very clear dukkha is not something that is part of being human. Dukkha is something that one human being produces in another human being. I make you unhappy because I hoard private property. I refuse to share wealth. I oppress you. Therefore, dukkha is caused. So Ambedkar made it very clear that human suffering is caused by human beings. The powerful are the ones who create suffering. So to get out of this suffering, what do? You develop an ethical worldview, and you then become this ethical subject of history. And he felt Dalits had the potential to be that way. As early as the 1920s, when he was arguing for Dalit political rights, he said, the Dalits will probably make better political representatives than others because they understand injustice, they understand suffering. And from that point of view, they will have a universal approach to justice. They are not seeking justice only for themselves, they are seeking justice for everybody else also. So for Ambedkar, the Dalits were the universal subject of history. Just like how the working class was a universal subject of history for Marx and for others in the socialist tradition. So to be this universal subject, Dalits had to become new people. And how do you become a new person? Overnight, you don't become a new person. But Ambedkar felt very clearly one must break with Hinduism. One must break with whatever makes you feel unequal, whatever denies your liberty, whatever makes you feel humiliated. And he very powerfully said, untouchability is really not the untouchables problem. It's a caste Hindu problem. Caste Hindus hate us. Caste Hindus treat us badly. We don't wish to treat them that way. He made that very clear. He said, if I want to put my child to school, that doesn't mean I will stop the caste Hindu from sending his child to school. But if I try to put my child in school, the caste Hindu stops me. So they have a very fragmentary sense of self, whereas I, as a suffering individual, can aspire to a more universal sense of self. And that universality, he felt, can be cultivated by becoming a Buddhist. So while others had created this modern Buddhism, Ayotitas, Bodhanand, Dharmananda Kosambi, various scholars, various thinkers, they had all argued for Buddhism as either being the original religion of the subcontinent or of Dalits as being original Buddhists. But Ambedkar makes a very different argument when he says, by converting to Buddhism, Dalits will become new universal subjects of history and they can set an example for everybody else. And which is why in the Buddha and his Dhamma, he makes it very clear it is not simply about abandoning one religion and adopting another. It is becoming another human being. And what sort of human being will that person be? And in the Buddha and his Dhamma, he says, Buddhism counsels karuna or compassion. But greater than karuna is maitri, because maitri is what he defines as social fellowship, something which treats the whole world, including plants and animals, as being interconnected with each other. So, in a sense, Ambedkar gives you the basis for an environmental ethics also. How do you treat the environment? How do you work with nature? Then he goes on to say, great karuna is important, but greater than karuna is maitri. And very important is thought. Each of you has to choose to be ethical. And he very interestingly, he says, it is not simply that there is this eightfold path and I blindly follow it. No, that's not what I'm saying. You have to understand that if you do not practice the eightfold path, you are going to create a situation where you will be harming others. Now, you have to choose whether you will do things which create good or you will do things which create ill effects for others. So, ethics is also something that you choose. You choose to be ethical. And therefore, thought has a very important role to play. You have to think, you have to reflect, you have to study, you have to educate yourself. So, therefore, thought is important. But Ambedkar then very importantly says, prajna is thought, is wisdom, is the power to discriminate. But he says, prajna is like a sword, it's like a sword with two ends. Both ends can cut. You can use prajna for good, you can use prajna for bad. So, how do you ensure that you use knowledge for good, thought for good? And he says, prajna should always be combined with sheel. It is very important to practice ethics. It's not simply important to say, I'm a Buddhist and I will sort of leave Hinduism, but to practice Buddhism, to practice ethics is very important. And we all know his own life, his own personal life was a demonstration of the ethical life. He lived a very strong ethical life in many, many ways. The way he continued to be a Democrat till the end of his life, the way he refused to compromise on his principles, he refused to have any favors done for either himself, his family, or his immediate circle. The way he made it very clear that if you're in public life, you have a responsibility to be ethical, that you can't make unethical choices. So I think he himself tried to practice the ethics that he later on felt that that was there in Buddhism. And so today I thought it was important for us to keep this aspect of Ambedkar's life and thought in front of us because we are living through very, very difficult times in this country. We all know this. I don't have to explain this to anybody. And at the same time, this is also historically very important for other reasons. Never before have we had, whether it is in our university spaces, in our student population, in our public life, in our cultural life, such a large Bahujan Dalit presence. And this large Bahujan Dalit presence is actually doing some extremely important creative work, whether it is with Dalit cinema, whether it is with literature, whether it is with political writing, whether it's with student politics. And this is a very precious thing we must nurture, we must build, because it is the future. It is going to set the tone for what will happen 10, 20 years from now. But we all know that this is being challenged. It's being very cruelly attacked in many ways. And sometimes it seems as if that there are shortcuts, that all we need to do is to access political power, things will get better. All we need is a better system of laws and things will get better. Certainly, political power is important. Certainly, better laws are important. Certainly, even better ways of being wealthy are important. But at the same time, Ambedkar would tell us that while you do all of this, remember that you are also creating a new ethical life. And your responsibility is to make sure that that ethics is not compromised. So I think the way he defines Buddhism becomes very important to us today, when our public life is so unethical, our political life is horrible, it's violent, it's completely lacking in ethics, and our social relationships have never been so cruel. We all, of course, know Hathras, but there are many hundred things that happen all around us where we are being extremely cruel to each other. And again, it is those that are placed in the margins of society, Adivasis, Dalits, oppressed OBC communities, who bear the brunt of this oppression and this violence. But they are also the ones who want to fight on principle. They are the ones who want the rule of law. They are the ones who uphold the constitution. So therefore, it is very important that while we do all of this, we also uphold Ambedkar's vision of Buddhism. Buddhism is not simply a refusal of Hinduism, it's the basis for a new ethics that Ambedkar wants all of us, whoever is interested in liberty and equality and fraternity, to embrace. You embrace it by conversion, or you embrace it by taking it very seriously and talking about it, trying to live on the basis of what the Dhamma has to tell us. So I thought it is something useful for us to reflect on as students, as teachers, and as those that see ourselves as emerging out of an anti-caste legacy. Phule, Periyar, Ambedkar, the great Adivasi traditions of this country, exemplified by Mirsa Munda and countless fighters in different parts of India. So I think there is something that speaks to all of us in Ambedkar's Buddhism. So I thought I would use this opportunity to communicate what I have learned from reading Ambedkar over and over again. Thank you for this opportunity. Now we can take some questions and carry this discussion forward. Jai Bhim, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you so much, Madam. There are some questions, Madam.
Sure.
From Havaldar Bharti. Was conversion of Ambedkar into Buddhism political stunt or spiritual?
I will answer each question. It's better that way, no? It will be easy. Yeah. From what I have discussed, I'm sure you will see it is no political stunt. He saw Buddhism as a very important ethical response to Hinduism, which was ethical in a very limited way. He didn't say Hinduism had no ethics. It was ethical in a very limited way, and he felt that the caste system compromised ethics in Hinduism. So therefore, you needed a worldview which was fundamentally ethical, and he felt Dalits, by converting to Buddhism, and anybody else who wanted to leave Hinduism could convert to Buddhism, which would make them into better ethical persons and stop them from following caste, stop them from being cruel to each other, and help them uphold equality, liberty, and fraternity. So it was not a political stunt. He had been studying Buddhism from very, very early on. In fact, in his PhD dissertation, in his MA dissertation, he quotes from the Jataka texts. So he was a student, a lifelong student of Buddhism.
Madam, one thing, one query is that, is Buddha and his Dhamma written by Ambedkar covers and explain philosophy?
Yes, it does. Ambedkar interprets it in his own way. His interpretation is unique. But he also says that he is basing everything he says on the source material, which is in Pali and Sanskrit. but he is giving it a different emphasis.
Okay, madam. Thank you, madam. Thank you so much.
Any other questions?
No, ma'am. Thank you very much, ma'am, for accepting our invitation and deliver an insightful lecture on behalf of Bapsa Siuji. We are very grateful to you, ma'am. Once again, I express our gratitude to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much for
Thank you
inviting
so
me.
much.
And thank you so much. Thank you
Jai
so
Bhim.
much. Jai Bhim.